Hi, welcome to the Parenting Reframe podcast. I am Albiona Rakipi, your host. I'm a former teacher, a parent, currently a pediatric speech and language pathologist, and I'm a writer. I've worked with thousands of children and families throughout the last 20 years, and I have learned so much. On this podcast, we'll approach parenting from a curious place. We'll ask questions and get answers, explore new ideas, unpack the unconscious beliefs and expectations we hold on to about parenting, and reframe what it means to parent. We'll search for solutions to some of our biggest parenting challenges, set aside judgments, and find our way through this wild journey. My hope is that this podcast is a space where parents can feel seen, heard, and supported. Welcome aboard, and let's reframe together. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Parenting Reframe podcast. I'm your host, Albiona Rakipi. So today I'm going to do a little bit of a mini-sode, but before we get started, I want to talk to you about my whining workshop that's coming up. It is called Stop the Whining and Start Connecting. So a lot of times whining is usually connected to A, gaining cooperation, and B, power struggles. There's obviously a lot more to it than that. So in this 45-minute live virtual workshop, I'm going to go over the 5 most common reasons why kids whine, what it really means when our kids are whining, despite the fact that it can be one of the most triggering behaviors for our kids to engage in. What do we do about it? How do we work through it? And can we get our kids to eventually stop whining? And the answer to that is yes. I will show you how. I will give you scripts to use, and I will talk to you about some of those triggers that come up for you and how we can avoid and tackle whining altogether. So make sure to sign up for that. There's information for that in the show notes, but that's coming up on April 4th. But for today, I want to address the idea of gaining cooperation by doing these very 2 small shifts. These are the 2 shifts that I usually recommend to parents when I'm coaching them. It's something that I've used myself, and I think they're so impactful, and they're small, but they're mighty. So number 1, this one's really hard for parents to kind of adopt because I think this has become a habit for a lot of parents, but the idea of giving reminders, warnings, and repeating ourselves has almost become normal. And I really want parents to get out of the habit of doing that. There isn't any reason for you to give multiple warnings, multiple reminders, and to repeat yourself over and over. And here is why. Generally speaking, when we give reminders and when we repeat ourselves, what starts to happen is we, the parent, become pretty triggered in that moment ourselves. So what we become escalated every single time we give a direction, repeat ourselves again. And what's our child usually doing? Either ignoring, not listening, not taking it in, not interested, right? All of those things are happening. So as that keeps happening, our frustration keeps growing. And then eventually we explode. And then we yell. And this is usually the parent that will come to me and say the only way they listen is if I yell or if I give really big, bold threats like, that's it, all your toys are going in the garbage, or I'm leaving, right? We give these threats that A, probably can't be followed through on, and B, quite frankly, are just big and grand, but they're not really thoughtful. We haven't really kind of given it the forethought that it needs to really be sure that you could even implement or follow through on something like that. But for your child, it's enough to scare them in the short term, so usually they abide. But at one point, they won't. And then what starts to happen is they realize that you don't really mean what you say. You're just saying these big, grandiose things, but there's really nothing to it. And you don't want your kids to view your directions that way. You don't want them to see you as somebody who's just a lot of talk and no action, right? So with that, what I generally recommend for parents to do is instead of finding yourself on the endless repeating train and on that warning train and on the reminder train, try to step off of it and try to pinpoint what is it that you want them to do. Is it to listen? Is it to clean up? Is it to get ready for bedtime? Is it to walk over for mealtime? Is it to play gently with their toys? Like, just think of whatever it is that you find yourself repeating over and over and over. And instead of finding yourself in that pattern, I want you to come up with an action to assign with the direction. You always want to pair an action with something you're saying. Kids are far more interested in what we do, not what we say. Remember, kids sense and feel more than they see and hear. So you repeating yourself over and over when they're playing, and they're far more interested in the play than what it is that you have to say, they're not going to stop playing. They're just not. Yes, there are some kids, temperament matters here, where it works and they do just listen, and that's great. But we're talking about the child that doesn't. We're talking about the child when you repeat yourself over and over, you find yourself completely frustrated and at your wit's end, and you overwhelm, and then you have these big explosive reactions and you're just yelling, and your child has learned to only listen to you when you reach that state. So it almost becomes counterproductive for everybody. The child learns that it isn't until they become completely unhinged that I have to listen, and you, the parent, learn that it isn't until I become completely unhinged that I actually get a response from them. So in both scenarios, we don't want either person in that dynamic kind of believing that. So instead, you want a parent action. So let's say, I think I've used this example before in some of the articles that I've written, but let's say your child takes a ball and throws it against the wall in the house, and you have a really clear rule that we can't throw the ball inside the house. So you say to your child, even before the ball comes out, hey, we're about to play right now. I'm going to bring the ball out. I'm going to bring this out, whatever it is. And you're going to say to them, I've noticed sometimes that you take the ball and you throw it inside the house, but we can't do that. We can't throw the ball in the house because we could hurt someone or we could break something. If you throw the ball in the house, I'm going to have to take the ball for 1 minute, and you need to take a break from playing and come and sit by me. A break is not the same as a timeout. A timeout is generally more punitive in nature. It's punishing. You separate the child, you isolate them, you make them feel bad about what they've done, you tell them that they're in trouble, right? It's a little bit different. A break is simply giving your child the ability to reset their body so that they can gain regulation and they are much more available to follow directions when they are more regulated. They might not like the break, but we have to teach them how to do that because we essentially want to give them the tools to self-regulate so that they can then listen the first time you say, hey, you're not allowed to throw the ball in the house. And then they just don't do it, right? But until they reach that point and recognize that every time they do that, you're going to follow through with some type of action, they're not going to hear you if you just repeat yourself over and over. So what sometimes happens, or what I generally see happens, is if we don't assign an action, the child throws the ball against the wall. The parent says, hey, we talked about that. We're not supposed to throw the ball against the wall, remember? He says, 2 minutes later, he throws the ball against the wall or against a toy or somewhere in the home where he's not supposed to. And then the parent says, hey, I talked to you about that. Remember, we're not supposed to do that. This is your last warning. The child does it again. We give another couple of warnings, and then we explode. We take the ball, we throw it in the garbage, we pop the ball, right? These big overreactions happen. The child's completely dysregulated at that point, and everybody's in a very heightened, sort of emotionally escalated state. Nobody's calm for the other. If you have a plan ahead of time, if you frame it out, and if you assign an action with your direction, you alleviate getting on that reminder train and constantly repeating yourself. That's where the frustration grows. So it's a game changer, because the second you have that plan in place and you know what to do and you're not repeating yourself, it is 10 times easier for you to stay calm. I've said it from the beginning, the biggest superpower you can hold as a parent, regardless of age, by the way, is the ability to stay calm when they get heightened. It is what will anchor them. It is what will help them calm down faster. If you can validate always the emotion and the experience that they're having, it doesn't matter if you think it's right or wrong. You just validate the experience and the emotion that they're having. You will exponentially change the trajectory of where they go in terms of a tantrum or an outburst. And this is true for teenagers too, by the way. This is not just for one age or just for younger children. When we can connect and we can stay consistent and we can embody our authority as a parent and not necessarily find ourselves on this constant hamster wheel of repeating ourselves, we will stay calm and you will remain confident and you will remain cool and you will be able to handle whatever comes your way. And that is going to help your child regulate much faster, much more so than anything you could say or offer in that moment. It's going to teach them how to regulate when they don't get the thing they want, or when they brush up against a boundary. They recognize that you mean what you say. You are what I call impeccable with your word, as is written in the 4 agreements. And as a result, your child recognizes that that safe space is there for them because they trust that you are going to hold that boundary for them, because they cannot. So that's number 1. Get off the repeating, warning, reminder train. That's what I call it. It's like we do all 3 of those things incessantly, and then what ends up happening is our kids just respond in a pretty negative way because we reach our max and everything sort of becomes explosive. The next thing you want to do to gain cooperation is you have to have a plan. So when I'm working with parents in coaching sessions, almost always what they'll say to me when they're enduring tantrums, or if it's a parent working with a teenager and they're finding themselves in this pattern of arguing or power struggles, whatever the case is, parent will often say, I tried this, one day I did this, sometimes I yell, sometimes I'm really calm, sometimes I try not to engage it, sometimes I ignore. They're giving me a ton of different responses that they've done between themselves and their partner. And the result of that, which by the way, I completely get it. I understand why a parent would do that because we really want to try something if what we're doing isn't working. But the problem with inconsistent responses is that our kids, again, I'm going all the way through teenagers here, they thrive on predictability and consistency. So when we respond in a way that's consistent and predictable for them, even though they might protest, even though they might seem like they don't like it, they need it. It is how we help them feel grounded. It is how we create a safe space. It is how we're able to embody that authority as a parent. And again, by authority, I don't mean punishing, mean, strict, cold, harsh. That's not what I'm saying. It's the idea that you can feel completely comfortable in the fact that sometimes as parents, our job is to make decisions that might not make our kids happy in the short term. And that is okay. That is part of what we have to do. And it is also okay that they're not happy about it. That's fair too. Doesn't mean we change what we're doing. So when you have a consistent plan, a consistent framework to follow up on, it will be a lot better over time for your child because what ends up happening is every time they do A, you follow up with B. And so they're going to try again and they're going to try again, but they're going to go, gosh, every time I do that, it doesn't really yield any value. Or every time I do that, my mom understands how I'm feeling. I get frustrated. But once I calm down, I'm able to go ahead and play or do the next thing, or I'm able to have a conversation that feels meaningful. So what we're doing in that moment when we're building that consistent, predictable response is we're helping our child trust and know that we are there and we're going to show up for them in a very consistent way. This is where coaching can be really helpful because often we want to know, well, what should the plan look like? Is it better to ignore? Is it better to connect? Is it better to validate? If I'm being too nice, does that mean that they're going to keep doing a bad behavior or whatever we qualify as a bad behavior? So those are all fair asks, and that's going to be really specific to you and your child. It's going to be really specific to every single person's household. Age of the child, if we're talking a teenager, it's going to be very different than a 3-year-old. If we're talking about a 10-year-old versus a 4-year-old, that's also different. So again, the plan isn't the same. It needs to change if it's not working, but we have to try things out for a little bit longer, right? Sometimes a parent will say, well, one time I did this and it didn't work. They just kept crying. And I'll say, okay, did we try more than the one time? And they'll say, no, because I just know them and it won't work. That's fair. I believe that all parents know their children best. I do truly believe that. But sometimes it takes more than one time or more than 2 times and more than 3 times. Sometimes it just takes a shift in the way we say something. Sometimes it takes a shift in the way we're showing up so that we're less triggered when they're in a completely emotionally heightened state. Sometimes it's we recognize we need support or help because we're just too overwhelmed to show up in a calm way. But we have to have a game plan. A game plan is going to change how your child's behaviors go from maybe feeling chaotic, feeling dysregulated, feeling kind of unpredictable and exhausting to then having some regulation, cooperation, and being able to really get through your day with success and a feeling of peace, really. So really think about how are you responding to the challenge that's coming up? Again, regardless of age, how are you responding to it? Is it a consistent way of responding? If it is it working? That's the next thing you want to ask yourself. And if it's not, let's really think about where do we go from here? And then are you just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and looking to see what sticks? Are you trying something different every single time? If you are, your child is left pretty confused in that moment and they're not really sure how to gain regulation. They become dysregulated, they get upset. Again, teenagers can get upset, everybody can get upset. But if we're just showing up differently every time that happens, they're not sure what to do with it. And remember, our role is always, always, always to think about how do we meet our child's needs? How do we connect? But how do we also create a safe space with boundaries? Boundaries are love. Our kids need it until they learn to start setting them for themselves. So those are the 2 small shifts I would tell parents to make almost immediately. Remember, you want to get off that repeat, remind, and warning train. It is not necessary. You teach your kids an unnecessary pattern when you do that, and you want to get ahead of it. So you want to attach an action to the thing that you are asking them to do. So they're going to look to see what is my parent going to do, not what are they saying. And then the last thing is you want to have a plan. A plan is going to help you stay grounded. It's going to help you stay connected because a consistent, predictable response to a challenge is always going to improve the overall long-term outcome of that. So I hope you got something out of that. Again, remember my whining workshop, we are going to tackle cooperation and power struggles in there because that's really deeply connected to whining. So if you want more information, more answers to your personal questions, consider joining live. And if you can't make it live, you will have access to the recording. So until next time, thank you for joining me. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever it is that you're listening right now. And what really makes my day is if you share or recommend the podcast to a friend. It is the greatest compliment. If you have not already, head on over to theparentingreframe.com where you can subscribe to get my weekly newsletter, Parenting Skimmed. 10 sentences delivered to your inbox every Thursday to help you parent and live a better life. It's for the parent who constantly told me, I just don't have time to read. Make sure to come and say hi to me on Instagram at theparentingreframe. My DMs are always open and I love hearing from you. Until next time, this is Albiona.